Hello and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This month we're going to paint a rainbow. So I'll have the reference material ready for you to download so you can try this exact same painting along with me, or you can watch me do it and then try it at your own leisure at home. And you don't have to do this, but what I did is I cropped it a little bit just by laying a piece of tape down, because the rainbow was almost in the exact center with the picture as it stood, and I'd like it to be just a little bit more off kilter. So start your painting by drawing the buildings on the watercolor paper, and then we're going to start right off the bat with the tricky part, because we have to paint back to front, and that means that we're going to need to get that sky down with a rainbow in it first. So I'm going to mix up the blue, and we want it to look kind of like this stormy blue, just like in the picture. The shade of blue is important, so I'm going to mix up a color and then match it. This is Payne's Gray and some Antwerp blue, and that matches really, really well. So then I'm going to move my picture off to the side, rinse out my brush, and just wet the whole sky area all the way down to the top of the buildings. And the buildings are darker than the skyline, so I don't need to worry about masking those. I'm going to be able to get a nice clear distinction by going over the top after the sky is painted. So I'm going to put my water down right over the top of all of those stovepipes. And then just quickly wash up with that clean water. Until everything is nice and clean. And then I've mixed up my color already for the background, but I'm going to actually start by painting that rainbow while my background is nice and wet. So I'm going to use a round brush, and I'm going to paint in that red first. So just sort of mark down where it goes, right about here. And since I'm painting wet on wet, you see how I get that nice natural looking bleed. Then I'm going to go right into the orange next to it. Remember that your rainbow is going to lighten up as it dries. This watercolor always does. So don't be afraid to go pretty heavy and intentional with those colors, or they're all going to fade to nothing. And I'm just keeping my stripes fairly equivalent. Striping them down just like this. I'll add a little bit more intentional blue. And move it over a little bit so that it will make more of the green. And then you end with that purple. Okay. Then I'll paint in that sky. And I'm going to keep it nice and close. And if that water is still all the way down to the buildings, I shouldn't have to do too much careful job, because the paint is going to always follow the water. So unless you put down a really, really heavy layer, after you've done that water masking technique, the water is going to ensure that the paint stays where you want it to. Finish it up here, and we're going to let it dry. Okay, one quick thing before the sky is dried completely. I'm also going to use a cloth, a wadded up paper towel, and blot in some interesting cloud shapes. Then you can go back, add some darker color while it's still wet. Don't cover everything that you blotted, and you're going to start making it look like a stormy sky. And then don't forget too that whenever you're painting in watercolor, you're going to get the best effect by mixing at least 2 different shades. So even if they aren't 2 completely different colors, don't be afraid to go wild with your colors and get some variation in there. Remember that your eye is attracted to contrasts, so you need contrast in color, line quality, and textures to keep your paste interesting. But now that's looking a lot better, and I am going to go ahead and let it dry, and then we'll come back to it and see what our rainbow looks like. Okay, our rainbow is looking quite magical. So let's move on down to the buildings and stuff going on in the front there. So you have to decide on the style that you want to use for your painting, because this is a pretty linear, you could go really literal and get every window in there and get the windows perfectly straight, or you might go a little bit more impressionistic. Keep everything a little bit more suggestive. You don't need to keep every single line razor straight. That's completely up to you. But I'm going to start with these lighter colors, get them down. So here, 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 some of this, and then we'll kind of go from there. One thing I like about this picture is that it has a distinction between those in and out of focus areas. And if you don't go really literal, you won't be able to tell a difference. So that's a consideration. Let's just get that first yellow down. Yeah, that's a good color. Just matched it with my little color matching thing. And all of these windows are either the same shade as the house or much darker. So I'm not going to worry myself about masking out any of those. I'm just going to paint. So here's a point for going a little bit more impressionistic, because there are some areas where the sky came down a little bit farther than it was supposed to, and that's going to be less noticeable if everything is a little bit more, sloppy. Impressionistic is a little bit more suggestive, and so you can't tell those sorts of flaws very easily. So it's really up to you. Let's just see where the painting takes us. I wouldn't even worry about it right now. The house next to this is a little bit lighter in color, Put that down. If you want to clean up the areas where the sky sort of came too close, you just do a little bit of rubbing with a wet brush. Since the paint is still really fresh, it should lift up pretty easily. Especially if you didn't use a staining color. There are some colors in watercolor that just stain your paper. Cerulean blue is a really bad one, and alizarin crimson. Those are the two main culprits that I usually deal with because they're always in my palette. So if you use alizarin crimson or cerulean blue, just know to be extra careful because you really can't lift the mistakes that you make with those as easily as you can with non-staining colors. I mean, it's easier to lift out even a really dark color like Payne's Gray than cerulean blue. Which you wouldn't expect that, but it's a fact. Speaking as a person who's been painting for about 15 years, I've made a lot of mistakes. I've tried to correct a lot of them. Yeah, alizarin crimson. And we've got this yellow house over here. It's a little bit brighter right on the corner here. I think brighter than this even. Let's go a little bit brighter yet. There, that's the ticket. Alright, so then I've got this orangey colored house right over here. And this is the out of focus one, so I'm going to keep my edges a little bit less distinct by going over with water at the edges and letting them sort of fade out. And just don't be afraid of adding lots of color. Remember what I told you, the watercolor is going to dry 2 to 3 shades lighter. So you just can't be afraid of going dark. Then we've got dark red right up here, which I'm going to mix with some brown madder and some alizarin crimson, so gotta be careful. But see how I just go from house to house? And since my drawing was careful, the painting phase of these houses is just a matter of being careful as well and following the lines that I've already drawn. So when you're painting something architectural like this, it really pays to give yourself a little bit of extra time with the pencil before you even pick up that paintbrush. So we're gonna let these dry. I'm gonna add the blue too, but it's the same thing. And then we're gonna add the darks to the rooftops. Then we'll go in with the windows and then push forward in the picture plane and do those weeds and the bushes and foliage going on in there. So let's just add this last little house. Don't ever be afraid to let a couple of colors mix on the page. I know you've heard me say that a lot, but it's one of those things that I learned late. And if I would have just done that one thing differently in my beginning paintings, they would have been 50% stronger. Because I was a careful drawer, I always was, but my watercolors, they would look really washed out, they're really boring. It's because I wasn't letting color mix on the page. I wasn't trusting myself enough, and I wasn't trusting the paint enough too. So with watercolor, a lot of the strength comes from the fact that it will do a lot on its own. It's not like oil color. Oil color and acrylics, they just sit where you put them. But watercolor is really active and vibrant. So don't be afraid to let it do its thing. I'm going to let this dry. I'll be adding this blue house as soon as this orange is dry and won't mix with it. And then I'll come back to you and we'll push on with those super darks. Okay, we're moving right along. Got some dark rooftops to put in here. Now, I don't want to make those rooftops boring, so I'm going to mix up some Payne's Gray and some reds and purples. And then we'll see if we can make them a little bit more interesting. So what you want to do with these rooftops is keep your material, your reference material, nice and close, and then you can refer to it as you carefully paint these wee little shapes. And I like to outline the precise lines of the roof first, and then quickly fill it in. But also you need to vary up the tone a little bit. Remember, variation. So here and there I'm going to leave some lines white, and then I'll fill them in with my lighter blue. Here's where watercolor is just your best friend, because you can just suggest some things, just suggest some shapes, and then the watercolor will make it interesting. All you need to do is not be afraid to put it down and leave it alone. You can do that, you're not afraid. And so you have the makings of being a fantastic watercolor painter, and you didn't even know it. In the back here, where my roof is farther away, I'm going to a more cerulean blue. Things get more blue as they are retreating in the distance because our atmosphere is blue. So, to add just a little bit more dimension to your paintings, cool them off as you push them farther away. So if you have a mountain range, for instance, it's really far, it's going to be a light blue. If it's getting a lot closer to you, you're going to start to see darker blue, and then the browns and the grays, the actual mountain. It's just when it's too far away, you can't see any of that stuff. So see how I kind of carefully go about my business, filling in this roof line, and I'm avoiding the light colored windows. And you could tape off the precise lines too. Just trying to see what kind of look I can get if I don't tape it off. You get a different look. The only key is that you need to be consistent. So if you start taping those lines, you need to do it throughout the whole painting. Otherwise, the lines you don't tape are going to look like you just got lazy or forgot to tape them. They're going to look like mistakes. But if you don't tape anything, it'll all hang together and just take on a different style. So this is getting sort of boring to watch, I would assume. So what I'm going to do is finish it up off camera. I'm just going to be filling in these dark roofs, then this roof, and this one over here is red. But it's very, very simple. You can tell by your reference material what I'll be doing. So let me come back to you in a zip zap with those filled in, and we will push on. Alright, I've added some of those dark roofs, so now we have to work on some more of the details in the windows and window shades, and also do some foreground stuff. We're really close to being finished here. So for those small details, I'm going to get a small round, but really most of your work you should be doing with a flat brush. That was hard for me to make that change over, but I was convinced, and I will do my best to convince you also. You're going to do a better job covering the large shapes evenly and making them look nice and realistic if you use a flat brush. But for some of these things, a round brush is really what you need. And always use the largest brush you can for the area for the smoothest coverage. Just do a little test and then go to it. And it's always the same process where you're just working slowly on the outside and then quickly filling in the inside and letting it stay a little bit loose. And letting multiple colors mix together on the page. You can remember to do those three things. You're really going to be far ahead of your competition when it comes to watercolors. And even if you're not competing, you'll just be producing really good quality work. I'm sure that's what we all want to be doing, right? Okay, now let me show you how to do some of this foliage. Right here, the greens are really loose and fuzzy, and then we have a few more precise, sharp limbs in the branches that come up over the top of the house. So I'm going to mix up a green, and for me, I prefer to mix up my own greens. So I use a yellow and a blue. And depending on the color of green you want, you're going to get a lot of variation depending on the colors that you mix it with. But just test whatever you put down. And then I'm going to start with with a flat brush. Make sure you have a nice sized puddle of your green mixed up before you even start. And then go ahead and use a lot of water for these loose ones. Let it stay nice and sloppy. Let the greens mix on the page. And in some places the green is going over the top of the building, so I can do this only because I've already painted the sides of the building. You could also, if you chose, finish the houses completely before you do the greens. I like to do it this way because there are going to be some places where you can have a little bit better push and pull between the foreground and the background if you've finished all of the foreground things, even though that is contrary to what I usually teach. It's going to be pretty simple to go back and add a few small details like some windows to finish the basic look of these plants. I'm not talking about painting plants over the top of unpainted houses or anything like that. So anyway, what I'm saying is it doesn't really matter at this point because I've finished the sky and most of this detail is going to go over the top of the sky, and I finished the sides of the houses and the other detail is going to go over the sides of those houses. So So you can just use a small brush then and add some of those small little details. And you can even use a brush handle to scrape through some really skinny lines like this. And that can add a lot of realism, especially if you scrape through from a painted area and then just make the branches. You're not adding additional paint, you're just reshaping the paint that's already on the board. So I like to do that quite a bit. But then for these edges, use that round and just break into it before it has a chance to dry a hard edge here, and bring it up so that it doesn't dry with a definite shape. You want it to stay nice and loose. Then I'm just doing the same thing to fill in these foliage areas in the foreground over here. And then I'll add some small details like this, stippling with the little brush to fill in some more of those green branches. Just make sure you get plenty of green paint, otherwise it's not going to cover well enough. And then take your time and do these areas over the tops of the houses with the branches really carefully. In the background here, it gets a little bit darker, so I have more foliage, but it's a darker green right back in here. So I'll just add that the same way. And I'm mostly stippling, and I'm using a darker, more close to a dark blue here. Let me just scan in so you can see what I'm talking about. And I'm going to paint the line of the house first so that I don't get it covered with green and I don't do a sloppy job, and then I can just fill up with those stippled marks. It's going to really help your realism too if you have some areas of white showing through. So don't paint it solid. See how I have some little whites? You want to keep those. Okay, then we need to back it up, do a little bit of work on the windows. I'm just going to show you how I would go about starting the process, and do a lot of this work off camera because it's very repetitive. But I'm just going to mix up that orange, and I'm starting on this yellow house. I like to find the bright colors or the odd colors and put those in first, because that way I don't lose my way in the drawing, especially when you're doing windows or a lot of geometric patterns, something like windows or doors, things like that. You can lose your place, and then you kind of, you're trying to use the reference material for guidance, but you just don't know exactly where you are in it. So what works better is to put in those bright colors first, and then it's a lot easier to know where I am. And I'm essentially just repainting, adding the detail that I didn't add. I have the marks down with the pencils, but I don't really know how completely accurate they are, so I'm going to use those as a guide, but use this careful process of adding the paint to really determine what goes where. So I'm saying that sometimes I'm going to paint right over my pencil lines and just disregard them, and that's completely fine. I didn't take the care in putting them down in pencil that I'm going to with the brush. See how I'm going to, I paint the border lines first, and then I make the connecting lines. After these dry, then I can add the shadow shapes, these really dark shadows in the windows. And then if I've done a careful enough job, I should be able to just be done with that window without having to go back in and retouch anything again. Okay, so I'm going to be adding the rest of these orange windows that same way. Then I'll need to add a blue roof, but you've seen me do that. When I come back, we're going to add the shadow shapes to the roofs and any last tiny little details, and then this will be a finished painting. So let me work on the windows for a little bit and come back to you. All right, so I've added those windows and some small details, and now the drawing is pretty much, or the painting is pretty much finished. One thing that you can do, so here in the foliage I added more paint and then I spritzed it with a water bottle and then just let it dry, and that's a good way to have to incorporate some interesting patterns. So let's say I didn't really like my sky so much. This is typically not something that you do, but since you didn't get to see me use the water bottle in the foliage, I'll go ahead and make some adjustments to this sky. I like it, but honestly I don't like the texture that it shows, because you could see the texture from the paper towel and I thought that was distracting. So I'm just going to go over the top with a different shade of blue. It doesn't really matter what, honestly. The overall color of the sky isn't going to change, but if you just apply a little bit more paint, I'll use some cerulean. Then you can play with the texture a little bit more easily, since the paint is helping to activate the underlying colors and it's not just water on there. Then I'll go ahead and spray it with some water. Something like this with a little spritz valve like that works well. And then I also have the trigger pull type bottles. I use both of them in the studio and they will sprinkle with different effects. So of course your texture of water is going to change the appearance in a different way than the finer texture. Let me just clean off my rainbow so it doesn't get too diluted. Give this another spray down here, and then I'm just going to let that alone and let it dry, and that will be the last thing that we do to the painting. So I'll come back one last time and show you how that spritzed water effect changes things. Let's move it over towards the rainbow just a little bit more. There. That's better. Now I'll spray to soften that. And you're going to get a lot different effect, by the way, if you spray wet on wet versus wet on dry. So right now, the rainbow wasn't wet, and so I'm not going to lose a lot of control by spraying. I'm going to get a different look if I had painted the rainbow and the background and then sprayed on top, so then the paint would be running everywhere. So let's let this dry and I'll come back one last time and show you the end result. When that wash in the sky is dry, then the only thing left to do is to take off the tape. And if you have stapled your paper to a support like I have, you can use pliers and take those staples out as well. I'm just going to take the tape off so you can see what a difference it is to have those nice clean white margins. There. It just sharpens everything up a little bit. So here's our reference. Here's what we ended up with. The rainbow in my painting is a little bit broader. It's a little bit brighter. Let's pretend that I didn't want it that way and I wanted to minimize that rainbow. First of all, at this point you have to make the decision if it's worth it or not, because there's a high risk when you do something like this that you're going to ruin your watercolor. But if you're not satisfied with it the way it is, then what's the risk, you know? So I'm going to go ahead and try to soften that rainbow up. And I'll do that just by using a wide, flat brush, washing over the top, and then repeatedly cleaning it out so that those colors are gradually going to lighten, but they aren't going to smear too much. There. Then I would just let that dry again, and it would be lighter. I can do the same thing right here where I think that that purple is looking a little odd next to the sky, so I'll just kind of wash it up like this and let that dry. So those colors are going to bleed a little bit, but for a rainbow that's not necessarily a bad thing. So that completes this tutorial on painting a rainbow in the sky. I hope that you've learned some things you can take away to your own studio. I hope you enjoy taking a whirl at it in your own studio. And most of all, I hope that you'll join me next month for another watercolor painting tutorial. Thanks so much for watching.